Sometimes the cruelest wounds come wrapped in familiar handwriting. I learned this truth on a gray October morning in my Brooklyn penthouse, when a letter arrived that would shatter my world and rebuild it stronger than ever before. The morning started like any other. I was sipping my usual Ethiopian coffee, watching the city wake up through floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's cars. My marketing firm was thriving, my bank account was healthy, and from the outside, Sigrid Morrison had it all figured out. But success couldn't fill the hollow ache that had lived in my chest for 3 years, the silence between my father and me that had grown so thick it felt like a living thing. That's when I saw it. A cream-colored envelope on my marble kitchen counter, placed exactly where I'd left my keys the night before. Strange. I lived alone, and my doorman was meticulous about announcing visitors. The address was written in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere me father's careful script, slightly tilted to the right, each letter formed with the precision of a man who'd spent decades drafting architectural plans. My hands trembled as I reached for it. 3 years. 3 years since our last conversation had ended in shouted words and slammed doors. 3 years since I'd chosen my dreams over his expectations, my independence over his approval. The return address showed a P.O. box I remembered from my childhood dad's old office mail slot from before he retired. I was about to tear it open when a familiar voice stopped me cold. "Don't be hasty, sweetheart." I turned to find Grandpa Arthur standing in my living room, his silver hair impeccably combed despite the early hour, his sharp blue eyes fixed on the letter in my hands. At 83, Arthur Morrison still carried himself like the successful businessman he'd been, and his presence commanded attention even in my own home. "Grandpa, how did you get in here?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Arthur had his ways, and a locked door had never been much of an obstacle for a man with his connections. "Never mind that," he said, moving closer with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to navigate the world despite failing eyesight. "Look at that letter more carefully, Sigrid. Something's not right." I wanted to argue. I wanted to rip it open and find the reconciliation I'd dreamed about for 3 years. But Arthur's tone carried a weight that made me pause. He'd been my anchor after Mom died, the one person who understood both my father's stubborn pride and my own fierce independence. If he sensed something was wrong, I needed to listen. "What do you mean?" I asked, holding the envelope up to catch the morning light streaming through my windows. Arthur moved beside me, his weathered fingers pointing to details I'd missed in my excitement. "The paper's too new, for one thing. Your father keeps his stationery in that old oak desk of his paper that would have yellowed slightly by now. And look here," he traced the air above the writing. "The slant is almost perfect. Too perfect." My heart began to sink as I examined the letter more closely. Arthur was right. Dad's handwriting had a slight irregularity, a barely perceptible shake that had developed after he'd injured his right hand in a workshop accident 5 years ago. This writing was smooth, confident, lacking that subtle vulnerability that had made his later letters so distinctly his. "But who would?" I started, then stopped. Only one person came to mind, and the thought made my stomach churn. "There's only one way to find out," Arthur said grimly, taking the letter from my suddenly nerveless fingers. With surgical precision, he opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The content was typed, cold and clinical. No warm greeting, no personal touches, just a stark demand for $50,000 to help Dad out of a critical financial situation that could ruin everything he's worked for. The letter warned against calling him directly, claiming his phone was being monitored by creditors. It provided only a cryptocurrency wallet address and a deadline of 72 hours. "This isn't from Dad," I whispered, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. Arthur's expression had turned thunderous. "No, it's not. But whoever sent this knows us, Sigrid. They know about the estrangement, they know your father's workshop accident, they even know his old P.O. box. This isn't random. This is personal." The violation of it hit me like a physical blow. Someone had studied our family, our pain, our broken relationships, and decided to weaponize it for money. The audacity was breathtaking, but what hurt more was how easily I'd almost fallen for it, how desperately I'd wanted it to be real. "We need to call the police," I said, but Arthur shook his head. "Not yet. Whoever did this is clever, organized. They've covered their tracks well enough to feel confident making demands. If we want to catch them, we need to be smarter." I looked at my grandfather, seeing the steel beneath his genteel exterior. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we find out who's behind this and make sure they understand the consequences of targeting the Morrison family." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. I called Jake Patterson, a cybersecurity expert I'd worked with on several campaigns. Jake had the kind of skills that danced on the edge of legality, and more importantly, he owed me a favor from when I'd helped him land a contract with a major tech firm. "I need you to trace a cryptocurrency wallet," I told him over the phone, reading out the address from the fake letter. Jake's laugh was humorless. "Someone trying to shake you down?" "Something like that. How quickly can you work?" "Give me 2 hours. These amateur scammers always make mistakes." While Jake worked his digital magic, Arthur activated his own network. Despite his retirement, my grandfather maintained contacts throughout New York's business community. Men who owed him favors, women who remembered his kindness during their early careers, people who understood that information was the most valuable currency of all. True to his word, Jake called back exactly 2 hours later. "Your scammer's not as smart as they think," he said without preamble. "The wallet traces back to several gambling sites and cryptocurrency exchanges. Whoever this is has been moving money regular. Looks like they've got a serious addiction problem. I've got partial transaction histories and some digital footprints that point to someone local." Almost simultaneously, Arthur's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it, and his expression grew grim. "Victoria Thorne," he said simply. The name hit me like a sledgehammer. Victoria Thorne, father's ex-wife, the woman who'd swept into his life 2 years after Mom's death, and swept back out again 8 months later with a substantial divorce settlement. I'd never liked her, had seen through her too bright smiles and calculated warmth. But I'd kept my opinions to myself, hoping Dad would figure it out on his own. "How do we know for sure it's her?" I asked, though my gut already knew the answer. Arthur showed me his phone. The text was from Marcus Chen, a private investigator who'd worked corporate security cases for Arthur's old company. The message was brief but damning. "Victoria Thorne. Divorced your son 18 months ago. Received $200 Kelvin settlement. Blew it all at Atlantic City casinos. Currently living in a studio apartment in Queens. Desperate." I felt a cold rage building in my chest, different from the hot anger I'd felt when I'd first realized the letter was fake. This was calculating, focused. Victoria had exploited my father's loneliness, taken his money, and now she was trying to exploit our estrangement for more. She'd turned our family's pain into her personal ATM. "What's the plan?" I asked Arthur. My grandfather's smile was sharp as a blade. "We're going to give Miss Thorne exactly what she's asking for, a meeting." I used a burner phone to send Victoria a text message that afternoon. I played the desperate daughter, perfectly confused, hurt, but willing to pay anything to help my father. I agreed to an initial payment of $5,000 in cash, but insisted on meeting in person to discuss the remaining $45,000. I suggested a small, intimate cafe in Greenwich Village, somewhere we could talk privately about Dad's situation. Victoria's response came back within minutes, eager and greedy. "Thank you for understanding, sweetheart. Your father will be so grateful. Meet me at Cafe Luna on Bleecker Street tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone. Come alone." The next afternoon, I arrived at Cafe Luna 30 minutes early. The place was perfect for our purpose, small enough to feel intimate, but public enough to ensure safety. Arthur was already there, seated at a corner table with a perfect view of the entrance, looking for all the world like a retired gentleman enjoying his afternoon espresso. I chose a table near the center of the room and ordered a cappuccino. I had no intention of drinking. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say, how I was going to play this, but seeing Victoria in person was going to test every ounce of my self-control. She arrived exactly on time, and I had to admit she still knew how to make an entrance. Victoria Thorne had the kind of polished beauty that required significant maintenance, perfect blonde highlights, designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's rent, and the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting her way. But when I looked closer, I could see the cracks. Her handbag was a good knockoff, not genuine designer. Her smile was a little too bright, her laugh a little too loud. She was performing prosperity, not living it. "Sigrid, darling," she said, enveloping me in a cloud of expensive perfume as she sat down. "You look wonderful, so successful, so independent. Your father must be so proud." The irony was suffocating. Victoria knew perfectly well that Dad and I hadn't spoken in years. She was counting on it. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Victoria," I said, my voice level and controlled. "I know you sent the letter." For a split second, her mask slipped. I saw surprise flicker across her features before the performance reasserted itself. "Sigrid, honey, I don't know what you're talking about. What letter?" "The letter demanding $50,000, the one supposedly from my father. The one with handwriting that's just a little too perfect, a little too steady." I leaned forward, holding her gaze. "The one you forged." Victoria's laugh was shrill, attracting glances from other patrons. "That's ridiculous. Why would I do such a thing? I'm not even in contact with your father anymore." "Because you're broke," I said simply. "Because you gambled away your divorce settlement and now you're living in a studio apartment in Queens, trying to figure out how to maintain the lifestyle you've become accustomed to." The color drained from Victoria's face. She looked around the cafe as if searching for an escape route, but I wasn't finished. "You researched us, Victoria. You knew about Dad's workshop accident, the slight shake in his handwriting that developed afterward. You knew about our estrangement, knew I'd be vulnerable to any contact that seemed to come from him. You even knew about his old P.O. box. How long did you spend planning this?" Victoria stood abruptly, knocking over her chair in the process. "I don't have to listen to this. You're just a bitter daughter who can't accept that your father moved on after your mother died. Sit down." Victoria. The voice came from behind her, calm and authoritative. Arthur had approached our table without my noticing, and his presence seemed to fill the small space. Victoria turned, and I saw genuine fear flicker across her features as she recognized my grandfather. Arthur Morrison was known in certain circles, and his reputation was that of a man you didn't want as an enemy. "Mr. Morrison," Victoria said, her voice suddenly much smaller. What are you doing here?" "Protecting my family," Arthur said simply. "Something you've threatened by your little scam. Sit down, we need to talk." Victoria sank back into her chair, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. Around us, I noticed that the cafe had grown unusually quiet, and I realized that several of the other patrons weren't customers at all, they were Arthur's people, positioned to ensure this confrontation went exactly as planned. "Here's what's going to happen," Arthur continued, his voice conversational but carrying an undertone of absolute authority. "You're going to confess to forging that letter and attempting to extort money from my granddaughter. You're going to explain how you gathered information about our family and used it to target us. And then you're going to face the consequences of your actions." "You can't prove anything," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually, we can." I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen, which displayed a detailed report from Jake's investigation. "Cryptocurrency transactions, gambling records, your lease agreement showing financial distress. We have everything, Victoria. The only question is whether you want to make this easy or difficult." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising to nearly a shout. "Your father ruined my life. He promised me security, a future, and then he just checked out. After the divorce, I had nothing. Nothing. I deserved that money. I earned it dealing with his grief and his stubbornness and his obsession with you." The cafe had gone completely silent now, every eye on our table. Victoria seemed to realize she'd said too much, but it was far too late. "So you decided to get revenge by exploiting his daughter's love for him?" Arthur asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I thought," Victoria began, then stopped. There was nothing she could say that would make this better. That's when I saw the two police officers enter the cafe. Arthur had planned this down to the minute, and as Victoria noticed them approaching our table, her face went completely white. "Victoria Thorne," one of the officers said, "you're under arrest for fraud and attempted extortion." As they read her rights and fitted the handcuffs, Victoria looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. "Your father will never forgive you for this. You're destroying what's left of your family." I stood up and moved closer to her, speaking quietly enough that only she could hear. "My family was already destroyed, Victoria. You just tried to profit from the wreckage. But here's what you didn't understand: some things can be rebuilt, and some people are stronger than you think." As the police led Victoria away, the cafe slowly returned to normal. Other customers resumed their conversations, the baristas went back to making coffee, and the world kept turning. But everything had changed for me. The victory felt hollow at first. We'd caught the person who tried to exploit our pain, but the original problem remained. Dad and I were still estranged, still trapped in a cycle of pride and misunderstanding that had cost us 3 years already. After giving my statement to the police and ensuring all the legal details were handled, I found myself driving toward New Jersey without really deciding to do it. The autumn afternoon was fading into evening as I navigated familiar suburban streets, past houses where I'd delivered Girl Scout cookies and yards where I'd played with neighborhood friends. Dad's house looked smaller than I remembered, the blue shutters faded and the front garden showing signs of neglect. His car was in the driveway, the same reliable Honda Civic he'd driven for 8 years, too practical to replace until absolutely necessary. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, trying to gather courage I wasn't sure I possessed. When I finally knocked on the front door, the man who answered looked like a shadow of the father I remembered. George Morrison had always been lean, but now he was gaunt. His hair had gone completely gray, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of worry and sleepless nights. When he saw me, his expression went through a rapid series of changes: surprise, hope, fear, and finally, resignation. "Sigrid," he said quietly, "what are you doing here?" "We need to talk, Dad. About Victoria. About the letter she sent." He began to shake his head, already starting to close the door. "I don't know what you're talking about. Victoria and I haven't been in contact since the divorce. If there's some kind of problem..." "Dad, stop." I put my hand on the door, not forcing it but not letting it close either. "Victoria was arrested today. She forged a letter in your handwriting, trying to extort $50,000 from me. She's been using our family's pain to fund her gambling addiction." The words hit him like physical blows. I watched him process the information, saw the moment when understanding dawned and he realized what Victoria had done. The door opened wider, and he stepped back to let me in. The house felt like a museum of my childhood. Mom's paintings still hung on the walls. My high school graduation photo still sat on the mantelpiece, and the familiar smell of Old Spice and coffee grounds wrapped around me like a memory. But there were changes: 2 empty spaces where expensive items used to be, a general air of loneliness that no amount of cleaning could dispel. We sat in the living room where I'd watched Saturday morning cartoons and done homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays and mourned losses. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 3 years of unspoken words. "She took everything," Dad said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just the money from the divorce. My confidence, my judgment, my ability to trust myself. After your mother died, I was so lost, and Victoria seemed to understand that. She made me feel like I wasn't just wandering through life anymore." I felt tears building behind my eyes, but I let him continue. "But it was all fake, wasn't it? She saw a lonely old man with some money saved up, and she played a role. The worst part is, I think I knew it even then, but I was so desperate not to be alone that I convinced myself it was real." "Dad," I started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish, sweetheart, please." The endearment, unused for 3 years, hit me harder than I'd expected. After she left, after the divorce, I was so ashamed. Ashamed that I'd been fooled. Ashamed that I'd let someone like that into the house where your mother and I built our life together. And I was angry at myself for driving you away right when I needed you most. "You didn't drive me away," I said, finally finding my voice. "I left because I was stubborn and proud, and I wanted you to accept my choices without question. I wanted to prove I could make it on my own, that I didn't need anyone's approval, but that doesn't mean I stopped loving you." He looked up at me then, really looked at me, and I saw my own pain reflected in his eyes. "I was so afraid you'd think less of me. Your mother always said you had good instincts about people, and you never liked Victoria. I was afraid that if I reached out to you, you'd remind me what a fool I'd been." "Dad, you weren't a fool. You were grieving and lonely, and someone took advantage of that. That says something about her character, not yours." We talked until well past midnight, years of hurt and misunderstanding slowly unraveling as we found our way back to each other. I told him about my business, about the success I'd found, but also about the loneliness that success couldn't fill. He told me about the quiet desperation of the past 3 years, about waking up every morning wanting to call me but not knowing what to say. "I have something for you," he said, eventually, disappearing into his home office and returning with a small wrapped package. "I've been working on this for months, but I wasn't sure I'd ever have the courage to give it to you." Inside was a leather-bound journal, and when I opened it, I saw his handwriting not the forged perfection Victoria had attempted, but the real thing, slightly shaky from his old injury, beautifully imperfect and completely authentic. The first page read, "For my daughter Sigrid, who taught me that love doesn't require approval and strength doesn't require permission." These are the words I should have said years ago. I read a few more pages, each one a letter he'd written but never sent, chronicling his regret, his pride in my accomplishments, his hopes for our reconciliation. By the time I looked up, tears were streaming down my face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of relief and joy. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for all of it. For not supporting your dreams when you first told me about them. For being so concerned with what I thought was right that I forgot to consider what would make you happy. For letting pride keep us apart for 3 years. I'm sorry too," I replied. "For leaving instead of fighting for our relationship. For staying away so long out of stubbornness. For not being here when Victoria was taking advantage of you." We spent the rest of that night and most of the next day reconnecting, sharing stories and memories, filling in the gaps that 3 years of silence had created. I learned that he'd followed my career more closely than I'd imagined, that he'd kept articles about my business successes and worried about me during the difficult early years. He learned about the challenges I'd faced, the victories I'd won, and how much I'd missed having him to share them with. A week later, I received another package, this one delivered by regular mail to my Brooklyn apartment. It was a small wooden box, handcrafted with the precision I remembered from Dad's workshop projects. Inside was a key and a note. "This opens the door to my workshop. It's always been your space too, whenever you want to use it. Love, Dad." 3 months after Victoria's arrest, I got a call from the district attorney's office. Victoria had pleaded guilty to fraud and attempted extortion in exchange for a reduced sentence. She would spend 18 months in prison and be required to pay restitution, though we all knew she had no money left to pay anyone back. Justice had been served, but more importantly, her scheme had accomplished something she never intended. It had forced Dad and me to confront our estrangement and find our way back to each other. I started spending weekends in New Jersey, helping Dad with projects around the house and learning to use the tools in his workshop. He taught me to work with wood the way his father had taught him, and we built things together: a new garden bench, shelves for his office, a jewelry box that reminded us both of one Mom used to have. The business world still demanded most of my attention during the week, but I found myself looking forward to those quiet weekends more than any client meeting or networking event. Success still mattered to me, but it no longer felt like the only thing that mattered. One Saturday morning, about 6 months after our reconciliation, Dad and I were working on refinishing Mom's old rocking chair when he stopped sanding and looked at me seriously. "I need to tell you something, Sigrid," he said. When Victoria first contacted me after the divorce was final, she said she had information about you. She claimed you were in some kind of trouble, that you needed help but were too proud to ask for it. I stopped working and gave him my full attention. What kind of information? She said your business was failing, that you were about to lose everything but didn't want me to know. She offered to be a go-between, to help you without hurting your pride. He shook his head ruefully. I should have called you directly, should have trusted our relationship enough to ask you face to face. Instead, I let her convince me that she was protecting both of us. The manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. Victoria hadn't just targeted Mesh, had been working on Dad too, using our estrangement as a tool to isolate him further and position herself as the solution to problems that didn't exist. She played us both, I said quietly. She understood exactly how our pride and stubbornness could be used against us. Never again, Dad said firmly. Promise me, sweetheart, whatever happens in the future, whatever disagreements we might have, we talk to each other directly. No intermediaries, no assumptions, no letting pride get in the way of family. I promise, I said, and meant it completely. As I write this now, 18 months have passed since that October morning when Victoria's fake letter arrived. Dad and I have dinner together every Sunday, and he's become something like an unofficial advisor to my business. His decades of experience in construction have given him insights into project management and client relations that have made my firm even more successful. Victoria was released from prison last month, and according to the conditions of her parole, she's required to stay away from both Dad and me. I heard through Arthur's network that she's living in Florida now, working at a hotel and supposedly attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. I hope she gets the help she needs, but I don't waste much energy thinking about her anymore. The journal Dad gave me has become one of my most treasured possessions. I keep it on my nightstand, and sometimes when I'm having a difficult day, I read his words and remember that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, and that families can survive even the worst mistakes if both sides are willing to fight for what matters. Recently, Dad started talking about wanting to travel, to see some of the places Mom always wanted to visit but they never got around to before she got sick. I've been thinking about taking some time off, maybe planning a trip together. There are conversations we still need to have, memories we need to make, and years of closeness to rebuild. Victoria's cruelest lie had become an unexpected truth. In trying to exploit our brokenness, she'd forced us to examine what had broken us in the first place. Her fake crisis had led us to address our real problems. Her attempt to steal our money had helped us realize what was truly valuable, and her manipulation had ultimately brought us closer together than we'd been in years. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be exactly what you needed, even if you couldn't see it at the time. Victoria thought she was preying on a fractured family, but what she actually did was give us the push we needed to heal. The letter that should have destroyed us had saved us instead. I keep that fake letter too, locked away in my safe alongside important documents and valuables. Not because I want to remember the pain Victoria tried to cause, but because I want to remember the strength we found in facing it together. It's a reminder that family isn't just about the good times, it's about the people who stand with you when everything falls apart, who help you pick up the pieces and build something better from the wreckage. The woman who tried to profit from our pain had given us something far more valuable than money. She'd given us our way back to each other, and for that, in a strange way, I'm almost grateful.